This is Criteria. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. I'm James Majewski here with my co-host Thomas Miras.
Hey, James.
And we are talking about the new Joel Coen directed Tragedy of Macbeth, starring Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand as Macbeth and Lady M.
Yep. Yeah, you know what? I hadn't seen Macbeth before this since seeing you in Macbeth when we were in high school in a community theater that no longer exists, I think.
That's right.
In Manassas, Virginia,
That's
Upstart
right.
Crow.
It was not high school. It was the year after high school.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I think it was our first year in college. Yeah, that was a great little community theater, and that was the Shakespeare play that I cut my teeth on. The Bard's play, or the Scottish play, as we say in the theater world. Mm-hmm. There's like this dumb superstition about saying Macbeth. My understanding...
Wait, really?
Yeah. My understanding is that this is how the story goes. This is how it was told to me. That Shakespeare had written this play as a means of impressing King James, who was the new king at the time. Mm-hmm. Shakespeare had enjoyed royal patronage, and now with new royalty, he wanted to do something to butter up this new king. And as the story goes, King James was into the occult, fancied himself a little bit of of an expert on the subject. Not that he dabbled in the occult, that's not what I've heard, but that he researched it and studied it and understood occultic practices.
Wow.
Again, this is all hearsay. I don't know if any of this is actually true.
Okay.
So Shakespeare gets this idea to write a play that would feature pretty prominently some elements of the occult. And he was going to write it about King James's ancestor, Banquo. So Banquo is put forward as a character that King James would have been aware of as being his ancestor, and the prophecy about the line of kings that is going to be Banquo's is actually an indication of King James's own ascendancy to the throne. And anyway, the verse that's used by the witches in Macbeth is the only time in all of the Shakespeare canon that this particular verse appears, this particular meter, right? Because it's unique in that way.
Is that like iambic quatrameter or something?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's not the iambic pentameter that
right.
Shakespeare typically writes in. And he does...
Well, there's 4 beats, so...
He does use a lot of different kinds of verse throughout his plays, but this one is unique. And it's led some people to speculate that these sections were actually not written by Shakespeare, but written by King James himself, who also fancied himself a bit of a writer. So the story goes that King James said, yes, you will continue to enjoy this royal patronage, and I'm going to, sponsor this play, but you have to let me write in some of my own sections. And the idea is that he wrote in actual sort of, because of his knowledge of the occult and of occultic practices, he had written in some actual incantations and actual sort of darkness into the play, and that the performance of this year after year after year over the centuries has just sort of amassed such a weight of negativity that even just the mere mention of the word Macbeth is enough to sort of like draw all of that down upon the performance. So people are like highly superstitious about this. The whole time we worked on Macbeth, we weren't allowed to refer to it as Macbeth. You obviously got to say Macbeth's name in the context of rehearsal in the play, but the rest of the time it was the Scottish play. And
it's bizarre.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
really
it
bizarre.
is.
Wow.
But there's also like a long history of tragedies that have occurred that are associated with the performance of this play. I think the very first production, there was like something bad to have happened, but there have been deaths. There have been like burning theaters that have burned to the ground. People have been injured. You know, it stands to reason because it's a quite ambitious play, right? Like there's a lot going on in this play. There's ghosts, there's sword fights, there's, you know, floating daggers and decapitations and visions, you know, of spirits. And, you know, it's there's just like a lot that happens. And so any theater that attempts to do this play has got its work cut out for it, and there's a lot that can possibly go wrong. I think I read somewhere about, you know, one production where like a real knife had been sort of mistaken for a prop knife and used. So yeah, you know, it's a complicated play with a complicated history.
Interesting.
Yeah, and anyway, it was a great play for me to cut my teeth on. It was sort of my initiation into performance. Into
what was your character again?
Okay, so I played Fleance, who is the son of.
Oh gosh,
Banquo.
You played Fleance?
Yeah, you know, I
thought you had a bigger role than Fleance for some reason.
Well,
I thought you were like Macduff or something.
This was what was interesting about that production, was that our director.
Well, I remember this.
Our director had taken the role of Fleance and sort of collapsed him together with a lot of the other sort of like ensemble attendant roles, you know, guys who like show in and say, you know, the king is on his way to Dunsinane or whatever.
Right.
And the idea being that Fleance was actually in the employment of the Macbeth household, and that Lady Macbeth was conducting this sort of behind this. She was having an affair with
that I do remember.
The pool boy.
Yeah,
basically.
I just forgot the character's name.
Yeah. So it was, you know, for a community production, it was quite a lot. We had prop guns, we had blood capsules, we, you know, had.
I remember there were guns.
Yeah, we had a full cast. You know, it was performed as if it was, you know, contemporary, and. Yeah, I fell in love after that, you know, with performance in general, but Shakespeare in particular. I remember thinking, man, this is cool. And you know, I've had the great opportunity to do a lot of Shakespeare since then. And so I'm not an expert, right? I don't fancy myself like a Shakespearean critic, but I do have opinions about Shakespeare and about the way it's performed and about Shakespeare adaptations. So that's what we're going to get into here.
Yeah.
You know,
well, it should be clear to the listener that I am going to be taking a back seat in this discussion after that monologue because I don't know anything about Shakespeare. And this is the first this movie, the Joel Coen adaptation, The Tragedy of Macbeth, probably was the first like professional Macbeth that I've even seen. I think I might have seen the play twice in, you know, like amateur productions. I'm not sure, maybe just once, but I've never seen it on film. So, and I guess maybe I read it in high school for a class or something, but that's the extent of my, you know, my exposure to it, other than knowing about Tolkien's kind of like odd relationship with the play. Right.
Yeah. Well, he was annoyed about several aspects.
He was
of the play,
annoyed
right?
that the woods didn't literally come, Birnam Wood didn't literally come to Dunsinane. He thought that was like a total cop out.
I gotta say, it is more or less impressive depending on how it's kind of rendered. If it's a bunch of soldiers just holding like twigs, sticks with leaves in front of their face, like haha, that's a little anticlimactic.
Right.
But if it's armies like chopping down whole trees and like bearing them forward.
Sure. Yeah. So Tolkien came up with the march of like the Ents and the or specifically whatever it is, not the Ents, but like the the trees that the
Yeah.
Ents bring
Yeah.
to Helm's Deep.
Right.
And as sort of his fulfillment of that
Right.
promise.
I also
in
heard
Macbeth.
that he was annoyed about another cop-out that that Macbeth shall not be killed by any man of woman born.
Mhm. I don't remember if he was annoyed by that, but he definitely had his own spin on that
Right.
in the character of Éowyn,
Right.
where instead of being a man who was ripped untimely from his mother's womb, it was Éowyn who's not a man. And I guess, well, no, Pippin
has his role to play.
Mary.
Right.
Mary actually is a man because hobbits are men. I don't know if you knew that.
I feel like I remember this
but
somewhere.
but anyway, not to go too far afield. But yeah, so Tolkien had a couple of little Macbeth references in Lord of the Rings. But he wasn't really a fan of the play. We watched this, and you not only did you watch this new Joel Coen adaptation, but you prepared by watching, I think, 3 other adaptations, right?
Yeah.
So which ones did you watch?
Yeah, well, so immediately before we watched the Joel Coen film, I had watched the Polanski version from like 1979 or something.
Mm-hmm.
The Orson Welles version. Sorry, I like spaced out for a second. The Orson Welles version from like 1948, and an adaptation, a film adaptation of the Royal Shakespeare Company's production starring Patrick Stewart.
Okay.
And the reason I put it that way is because this was a film adaptation that was not made, as a film adaptation first and foremost. It was a theatrical production. It had a run on Broadway. It won some like Tony Awards, I think. And then I guess as a means of documenting it, they adapted it for film. And so it's awesome to watch, but as you're watching it, it's very clear, that the choices that have been made are choices for the stage. And the performances that you get are performances that feel like they're coming off the stage,
Right. Right. So how would you rank those 4 adaptations?
Including the Coen one?
Let's say rank all Macbeth film adaptations, including the Coen one that you have seen.
I've also seen
the Fassbender one.
The Michael Fassbender one. I forget the name of the director on that, but that starred Michael Fassbender as Macbeth and Cotillard. What's her name?
Marion Cotillard.
Marion Cotillard, yeah, as Lady Macbeth. And then there have been some others that are non-English adaptations. In particular.
You know what? I have seen Throne of Blood.
Yeah.
Because you gave me for Christmas years ago a DVD Criterion Collection. It's actually my first Criterion DVD that I ever had.
Cool.
And I haven't watched it since then, really. But Akira Kurosawa did his own like Japanese transposition of Macbeth. It's not the Shakespeare text, but it's sort of that story.
Yeah, and Toshiro Mifune
plays
this Japanese general who is the equivalent of Macbeth, and it's awesome. It's awesome. But
I'll have to watch it again.
It kind of exists
because it was before I was really into cinema, but when I watched that, so I don't think I was able to appreciate it. as much.
Well, it's amazing, but it kind of exists in a separate category because, as do all of the non-English speaking Macbeth film adaptations, because in those instances, the directors are totally liberated from having to deal with the text, and that's kind of like one of the
kind of a
central.
big deal.
Yeah, it's like one of the.
And given that Shakespeare got his plots from elsewhere in the first place, I wonder how much you can even say that sort of thing is like based on Shakespeare or like inspired by Shakespeare.
I see what I'm saying? I see what you mean. Yeah. I don't know about the story of Macbeth, but certainly,
Macbeth has previous sources.
Okay,
I
cool.
was looking at that. Yeah,
cool.
So how would you rank the actual Macbeth film adaptations you've seen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think Orson Welles is at the top, and the reason I say that
Orson Welles.
Yeah, the reason I say that is because it seems to me like anytime you do a film adaptation of Shakespeare, you're dealing with two things. You're dealing with a lot of things, but two things in particular. One, we've already mentioned, is the text, and two is, the visual vocabulary. Film being it's like a truism, and I guess you could disagree with this to some extent. It's debatable, but film being primarily a visual medium.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in the Orson Welles adaptation, those two elements, the language and the visuals, are just firing on full throttle.
Uh-huh.
And so I put that at the top.
Yeah. Yeah, I watched most of that this afternoon. I still have like 17 minutes left to go.
That's cool.
But I liked it. Yeah.
I think after the first 15 minutes, it's clear, that this is a masterful adaptation.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Now, just to like skip right to the bottom, I kind of put the Joel Coen one there right at the bottom, because for the same reason, basically, that I think it kind of skirts the problem of the language.
Yeah.
And it kind of fails on the level of the visuals. And
interesting. Okay, well, I agree with the first, and I'd like to hear your explanation on this the second.
Now,
how's the Polanski? Is that
okay?
Good?
So the Polanski one is awesome, but I would put it somewhere in the middle of the list because there are some issues that I have with it. So, like, for instance, I don't know if it was the first film that Playboy produced or like one of the only films, but it was like produced by Playboy. Hugh Hefner is like a executive producer on the film.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's very weird. I guess for a while Playboy sort of thought it would be a movie studio,
a media empire.
Yeah. And so so there it's not pornographic per se, but there's like kind of I would call like a pornographic attitude in the film. It's very brutal. It's very violent. Whereas like in the Orson Welles version, when Macbeth sends his soldiers to go slaughter Macduff's wife and children, the camera kind of mercifully like cuts up as we see the sword coming down on the child.
Yeah.
But in the Polanski one, things are a lot more explicit, and there's some places where that's successful. The final duel between Macbeth and Macduff is awesome. It just feels like very medieval. They're like just smacking each other, in the armor, and their swords are just like bouncing off each other until finally Macduff gets him in through like an opening in the armor, and it just feels very like gritty and real. But then there are other instances where the sort of explicitness or the brutality is just kind of like, it's just much, does that
Playboyism express itself in like a sexual way in the film, or just in terms of how it handles other elements?
Yeah, I think it's mostly just in terms of other elements. To my recollection right now, yeah, there's some nudity, but it's not in a sexual context. But for example, when Macbeth goes to visit the witches towards the end of the play, later in the play, to sort of like find out the future from them some more.
Right.
It's not just the three witches he ends up stumbling upon, but like a whole coven of these, mostly older, sort of misshapen ladies, but they're all naked. And so it's like, there you also, I think, see some of Polanski's interests, because Polanski is very interested in the occult across his body of work.
Really? Not just Rosemary's Baby?
No. There's several other movies too, and he's also, kind of perverted. I mean, like he is perverted. Like he had to flee the United States, but his filmmaking, his movies are kind of perverted in a way too, and so I think that handling of the occult in Polanski's is a disservice to the play, because it just puts it out there. You know what I mean? It just kind of like, it's very frank and not shrouded in mystery in the way that Orson Welles, for instance, in his, like, you never even see the witches. Their faces are always
Yeah.
blackened, and you
Yeah.
just see their outlines. And so,
Right.
with Orson Welles, those elements are handled much more poetically, much more metaphorically. It's like, it's the fog or the wind or the bubbling, there's a lot of imagery. It's their silhouettes. Whereas
Mhm.
in Polanski's, it's like a bunch of naked women around a cauldron, putting in like the liver of a blaspheming Jew, and it's like, just very, very in your face, and just robbed of any of its kind of mystery is maybe the wrong word to use for it, but it in its explicitness, it somehow reduces it. Does that make sense? It
Yeah.
kind of cheapens it. It trivializes it. It almost, there's like a fascination that I think is pornographic, or at least analogously pornographic.
Well, it sounds like a workman-like fascination where you're like, how does this actually work? Like like somebody who wants to show a realistic occult ceremony or something.
Yeah.
Is that sort of getting at it?
I think so. I think so. Whereas I think that Orson Welles has a sensitivity to the spiritual reality of what all of these things represent. I think Welles just straight up puts the prayer to St. Michael in the film.
Yeah, which is an anachronism. I like that. It's a nice bit of anachronism because it was invented by Leo the 13th.
Right. Yeah, like hundreds of years later. But like, but I think that it's a nod on Wells's part that he's working in images of something that can't be imaged, something that like goes deeper, and so it's like a lot more troubling, but it doesn't wound you in the way that seeing some of these more explicit depictions in a Polanski piece, like, I felt wounded afterwards. I just felt like, ugh, I don't want to like carry this around with me. That was like brutal.
That's too bad.
Yeah. Some other film adaptations do sort of venture into the realm of the sexual. The Fassbender Macbeth, I can only recommend with, the qualification of, that there is like some sexual stuff in there, which is annoying. But otherwise, that's a striking adaptation in its own right. And
sure.
I think, if I don't know how well that was received, like sort of critically. But I certainly think that it's a better addition to the canon of Shakespeare film adaptations than this present Macbeth.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know where to begin. But
well, I mean, you mentioned the language. I think we agree on that. I think that for the most part, now you could hear it. The meter was pretty clear in this Joel Coen adaptation. In most of the performances, I thought that they kind of like they got the music of the poetry across, but I wonder if that was somewhat at the expense of the performance or the sort of the emotion and the sort of the thought behind it, because the language did feel, and I would say this particularly in the case of Denzel Washington's performance, is somewhat flattened, by comparison with say Orson Welles' performance of Macbeth.
Right.
And so I think that the Orson Welles clearly does a better job with the text, balancing the different elements of the text. It wasn't like it wasn't poetic, but I think that those elements of dealing with the text were better balanced, maybe.
Right.
And I don't claim to know what the thought process was as far as that goes in the Joel Coen one, but I felt the effect was kind of a flattening of the language.
Right.
Maybe it was just because I had already watched the Joel Coen version a couple days before, but when I was watching the Orson Welles version, I felt like I could understand the text better, and that might have been because of the way it was performed.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think obviously Denzel Washington and Francis McDormand know how to handle Shakespeare and Shakespeare text. So
Hmm.
this is like my criticisms are not, at all like uh I recognize it as a choice basically that
Uh-huh.
that
Sure.
Denzel Washington is clearly doing something different with the role and with the language. I just don't know that I like it that much, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, there is like this kind of muted quality to the
Yeah.
language throughout. And actually, you know,
And to his character too.
mhm,
His character is very kind of like uh quiescent. I don't know,
mm,
like kind of like he's kind of um a less active, like a less, I don't know if there's an adjective for agency, but he's less feels like less of an agent. He feels more like someone who is kind of suffering these
yeah,
things,
yeah. Well,
if that makes
no,
sense.
totally. And it is a fine line to walk with this play, right? Because really, the way I see it, like the drama of the play is over pretty quickly. Like
Right.
the first act, like when the witches come to Macbeth and tell him he's going to be king,
Yeah.
and then the way that works on his
Yeah.
ambition, and then the stings of conscience, and
Yeah.
being sort of convinced by his wife, and the back and forth, and then
Yeah.
killing the
Everything's
king.
decided pretty
Yeah,
quickly,
the rest of the play
and
is just like
fate working itself out,
basically, yeah,
right?
the way you just described
Yeah.
it, like just things happening to Macbeth.
Yeah.
Now, so it's
Or him digging himself deeper, at least to some extent.
yeah,
Yeah. But
yeah. But
yeah.
but but we see how those choices that he's making are the wages of sin, that they're the
Right.
fruit of. so
Yes.
so it is a fine line to walk, in how you portray that, because frankly I think it can get kind of boring, um in like the latter three-fourths of the play, where it's just
Mm.
like, okay, yeah, I get it, this is just getting worse and worse and worse. So like finding where the drama is, and I think that a lot of it is in seeing the sort of uh the chances for turning back. Macbeth says that he doesn't have any chance. There's one point where he says, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm now steeped in blood so far that to go back is just as tedious as to go forward. So it's like,
Hmm.
why not? Blood will have blood, but
Yeah.
but it can sort of play out very matter of factly, and it kind of does in this adaptation.
Hmm.
And I think that one of the things that uh, gets me, if we're going to talk about the performances, because we were also talking about the language, but this is more specifically about the performances, is that like in this particular vision of Macbeth and of Lady Macbeth as well, I didn't really feel like I had much reason to care about either of these people.
Mm.
I don't think that I was really sympathizing with them at all. Um
Hmm.
I think that, you know, like perhaps that's a choice that was made, but I don't see why. Like why wouldn't you want your your audience to care about what happens to Macbeth and to his wife? I
Hmm.
think that like it's a tragedy, right? And so
Is there any point at which we're supposed to sympathize with Lady Macbeth?
I mean, it's that's an open question, right?
Yeah.
Like when she dies and Macbeth's response is she should have died hereafter. Like that can be pretty devastating, you know?
Hmm.
Like, whoa. In the Marion Cotillard was an amazing Lady Macbeth, I think. And in that one, they framed everything around the death of their child, because Shakespeare alludes to this in the
Right.
play that
Yeah.
that they've had a child. Now that child is nowhere to be found, so the understanding is that that child must have died young, and
Right.
and so that Fassbender Macbeth opens with the cremation of their dead child, who's
Mhm.
like a toddler, and
Right.
actually really cool. Her out damned spot monologue is delivered all sort of you don't realize this until the end when the camera shifts and we see where her gaze is. She's had this blank stare for the whole time, and then we realize that she's looking at this ghostly image of her dead child.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's like
Wow.
it's and so yeah, like you really sympathize.
Hmm.
Now, like that's a whole other thing, like the balance of how you play Lady Macbeth, because
Right.
I kind of fundamentally see this as an Adam and Eve story, you know?
Hmm.
Like
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
its
Totally.
appeal is in this kind of like man and woman who are supposed to be, you know, for one another, are bringing each
Right.
other down and
Yeah.
and lead to the ruin of both.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in the whole like kinds of debates that you get into with Adam and Eve, like who's more responsible? Is it Adam? Is it Eve? You know, I feel like you have the same kinds of arguments about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
and I've seen
Yeah.
versions of this where Lady Macbeth, it almost comes across as this sort of, you know, like totally conniving, totally evil, totally manipulative party, and Macbeth is kind of this like haphazard, or not haphazard, hapless sucker, you know, who like
Right.
if it weren't for his wife, he would have you know, done the right thing.
Yeah.
And okay, that's like a choice that you can make, but
That's why it's important that he starts having those thoughts before she
right.
proposes this
And
plan.
he does,
though.
in fact, start having those
Yeah.
thoughts
Yeah.
nearly instantaneously. But I
Yeah.
think that that's where the excitement is for us as the viewers, is watching all of these operations, right? Seeing how Macbeth is drawn in from the first, how
Mhm.
he begins to change the way that he speaks to Banquo right away. You know, what is behind the words that he speaks to the king. You know, one of the things about Shakespeare is that it's often said that there's no subtext in Shakespeare. In a lot of contemporary, you know, plays and film, obviously, the meat in the scenes is in the subtext so often, not in what's being spoken, but what's sort of underneath. And really, 99% of the time, that is it's never the case with Shakespeare. Like the meat is going to be on there. If characters are feeling something, they're saying something. But I think one of the
Mhm.
things that makes, you know, Macbeth so interesting, or, you know, like take another character like Iago from Othello so interesting, is that there's space too for the actors to play some subtext, you know, like
Mhm.
what is underneath the words. And so yeah, so seeing that corruption, you know, I think I described this to you as like the original like Anakin turning to the dark side. You know, it's like that. I don't know if that's what George Lucas was thinking about with that character, but it seems to me like he had to have been a student of what Shakespeare did with Macbeth, because
Mhm.
because this is like the sort of quintessential story of, you know, the man who is just corrupted and finds
Yeah.
himself as the tyrant, you know, by the end of the play with his head on a pike.
Right.
So I think that with both Denzel Washington's performance of Macbeth and Frances McDormand's performance of Lady Macbeth, we sort of just find them where they are. Like they're both already kind of it seems like they're both already backstabbers.
Hmm.
You know, it doesn't seem like we're given much reason in the performances to think that like this is much of a leap for them, or that this is much of a
Yeah.
change, right? Um, And
Now, textually, Lady Macbeth is a backstabber from the beginning.
yes,
But in the Wells performance, and I actually wasn't sure how I felt about this, and I don't know the name of the actress, but she, there's a lot of moments throughout where you can see her fear and uncertainty.
totally.
I mean,
totally. And there's room for that. There's room for that in the text, you know, for the.
I mean, that's why she says she has to pray to the evil spirits at the beginning to sort of, she says to unsex me, you know, meaning take away my womanly, you know,
but then
irresolution.
Also when she begins to see what's happening to Macbeth, you know, and how she receives that and what that does to her in this Joel Coen film, you know, it almost just feels like Frances McDormand is annoyed that she's being left out of things. You know, it's like Macbeth is just calling all the shots and doesn't need her anymore. And and even at the end, we're given, it's suggested to us that she's killed by one of these other characters, by one of the other attendants, Ross, who in the Joel Coen version has been sort of made out to be a kind of Littlefinger character. For anybody who's seen the Game of Thrones series, this character has kind of been Game of Thronesified, and he's this scheming sort of behind the scenes Machiavellian kind of character. And although we don't see him push Lady Macbeth down the stairs, Joel Coen really wants us to think that this is what happens. And so it's almost as if we never see Lady Macbeth even really descend into anything like madness. We're given her night walk monologue where she's you know, rubbing her hands, and but at the end of it, she like turns very knowingly to the doctor and the sort of handmaid that have been watching her and tells them to go to bed. And it's almost like, wait, is she crazy? Is she aware of what she's doing? You know, and that's just another example of what I think is sort of like a litany of instances in this film where there's a gesture that's made or sort of like the wink of an eye somewhere, and I don't know to what end. I don't know what we're supposed to think. I don't know what it's getting at. And in fact, it seems to like undermine what otherwise could have been, you know?
Interesting.
Yeah. And so same too with Macbeth. I mean, he obviously gets more agitated as the movie goes on. He gets more violent. There is a shift after he kills the king. But you know, it sort of lacked that the intrigue of being you know, drawing me in to what's happening. I mean, even for instance, the second time when Macbeth goes to see the three witches, I think it's significant that he doesn't go to see them, that they come to him again, you know? So it's like, there's something in that, in his now going out to seek them, you know, and meeting them on their ground, you know, that he's going deeper into this. But here, they just come to him again, you know, and we're treated to some like interesting visuals, but like fundamentally, there isn't this sort of this movement, this progression, this descent that you know, I think otherwise would occur. I mean, think about that Wells version, man. When he runs outside and like there's the, you know, it's like he's summoning them now. He's conjuring them. So yeah, you know, there's clearly a lot of choices that are being made, but I don't know that that they're for the most part serving the vision, you know, serving the purposes of the film. You know, I think that so often actually they work to reduce or even to undermine. Another big example that comes to mind is the three witches themselves. So, you know, probably like the most spectacular aspect of this film is
Yeah.
the performance that's given by, I looked her up. She's a performance artist and theater maker, Catherine Hunter, I think was her name.
Yeah.
Um,
She plays the old man too. I don't know if you noticed that.
yeah, I did notice that.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't. We'll get to that. But she does this like crazy contortion-y, very like Andy Serkis Gollum kind of rendition of the witch, who is very singular in this film. I don't care that like sometimes she's flanked by two shadowy figures and sometimes she goes into some different voices. Fundamentally, this is a single witch. I mean, it's an accident to her that there are these other two things. They don't operate at all, except to say like, oh, it's the three witches. No, it's not. You've collapsed it all into one. And this bothers me too. I think that something is lost there. I think that, you know, there is a sense in the three witches of, you know, that this is something that whatever is being tapped into is something that spans, it's much bigger than any one person. And oftentimes you see the three witches portrayed by women of different ages. So there'll be like one very old woman, maybe another who's more middle-aged and another who's young. You know, and I think there too is a sort of nod that this is something that spans generations and it's ancient and it's you know, well, enough said. Here, like, the attention is squarely on this, you know, admittedly fantastic creature, this woman who gives this incredible performance, but I think it reduces what the three witches represent, the powers that they represent, you know,
Interesting.
the seduction that they represent. Now, you know, you mentioned too that she plays this old man. Now, I had taken that to be the witches in disguise. I don't know if that was what was intended.
I wasn't sure what to make of it, but even when I was watching it, I thought the lips were similar, and I was like, I think that's the same.
I think it's the same actress.
Yeah.
Did you?
It is.
So I thought, okay, yeah, here are the witches working another angle.
Right.
But like that, all of those sequences did nothing for me, man. I'd have to go back and look at it, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of that text was taken. Some of the text, it's sort of like a cut from other parts of the play, and what Joel Coen does is create a sort of subplot that doesn't exist in the play, and even seemingly brings in some lines from other plays of Shakespeare's. I think, I think when the Ross character first comes on this old man, he's singing a ditty from Twelfth Night, I think.
Interesting.
By the Clown Feste. So
yeah, okay.
You know, I don't know if there's anything to that, but listen, for me as a viewer, you know, even one sort of knowledgeable enough of Shakespeare to know that there might be some other references that are resonating here, it did nothing for me. You know, it didn't really like add anything to the story. It didn't really add anything to the intrigue of the witches and of their action. If anything, it was kind of like jarring and almost clownish, you know, like I didn't go for it. Same to, did I not really go for the whole Ross angle of Ross being this, in the play, he's just one of the other lords. You know,
he's turned into sort of a double or triple agent.
Yeah.
In this.
Yeah. And actually that's not original to Joel Coen. Polanski does something similar with the character.
So in the Coen version, are there any other major changes made to the story or like reordering of things? Not off the top of my head. I noticed in the Welles version, there's parts that are reordered, like there's scenes that are switched around. What do you think about that? He does a lot of that. And like for any Shakespeare purist, that's obviously going to like really bother them. But I'm not that. And I value the art of adaptation. You know, I think that adaptation has demands, you know, and limits.
and that Wells understood this. I can't speak highly enough of that version. And for anybody who's excited to watch, Denzel Washington have his turn at this, like, by all means, check it out. But if you only have time to watch one, film, Macbeth, watch the Orson Welles, man. It's doing so many of the same things that the Coen film is doing, but better, I think.
They both have this kind of like minimalist, expressionist thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Going on.
Dude, I am tired of this A24 look. I'll tell you what, man. Like, I'm
So let's explain to the listeners about what A24 is, just in case they don't know.
Okay, well, I've been talking a lot, so you take this.
Well, you've certainly seen more of their films than I have. A24 has been around, I don't know, for almost a decade now, probably. And it's a film distribution studio. Maybe they produce now as well. And they've done a lot of different things, but they've become chiefly known in the past few years for artsy horror and just like weird, quirky movies. I think I've only seen 4 of their movies. I've seen Lady Bird. I've seen The End of the Tour, which was The End of the Tour, which was a movie about what's his face, that author everybody loves. And I've seen The Green Knight, which we watched together and decided not to review because we didn't like it.
Right.
We disliked it much more than we disliked this, I would say. And then this Macbeth, and The Green Knight, and they all have this like very, nice lighting, good cinematography from a purely visual craft perspective,
But I'll tell you, man, it's beginning to feel more and more empty,
It's beginning to feel like a shtick. Yeah, for sure. And we didn't, as a tangent, we didn't like The Green Knight because it was basically just like a subversion of the original story. I would recommend that people read the long essay that Stephen Greydanis wrote about the film, because he really gets into the details of like to what degree this is a deliberate subversion of the medieval poem it's based on. It's not, when I watched it, I kind of thought this is just kind of muddled. But then I realized after reading Greydanis' essay, like just how deliberate it all was. Although it still is kind of muddled also.
Yeah.
But, anyway, so, they do these artsy horror things and these Ari Aster films, which you've commented on here, in our Nosferatu episode, which you're not a big fan of. I know you like The Witch.
Yeah.
They did The Witch.
Yeah, well, and The Witch is an interesting film to consider in contrast to this Macbeth, because there's an example of language being handled beautifully. Like, it's not a Shakespearean movie, but it's it's set in sort of early colonial America. We're talking like early Pilgrims, and they're speaking in this very old dialect of English, and a lot of the text, I understand, was taken from actual like primary sources,
right.
And so it has this very authentic feel, but then also in the way that it's performed and sort of infleshed in these performances by the actors, it's very powerful. The language is not an obstacle, and in a Shakespeare adaptation, not only should the language not be an obstacle, it should be the opposite of that. It should be a whole other vehicle, a whole other conduit for meaning, and I just kind of felt like that was not realized in this adaptation.
Yeah.
Now, again, like, I will grant that Denzel Washington knows what he's doing. So I'm not like sitting over here going like, yeah, this guy's a crummy actor. Obviously not. But the choices that are made with the text here, I don't really get what the point was, There's kind of this there was like what felt at a lot of times like rushing through the lines, a kind of like mechanical quick, rapid fire delivery, which was like interesting, but kind of at the surface. And what was strange about it was that it wasn't even consistent across the performances. So I would say that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth both had kind of a similar quality in the way that they handled the text. But other characters, that was not the case, especially some of the smaller characters. A lot of the smaller characters came up and were like, yo, I'm speaking Shakespeare, you know? And I'm like, yeah, okay. Like, you know, like this doctor, you know, he's jamming, you know?
Yeah, and I was gonna say, like, Ross has a very different way of reading the lines.
Well, that's like a whole other thing too. I mean, he's on the other end of the spectrum. He like broke up everything into like tiny little morsels.
Yes.
And
what'd you think of Stephen Root's performance as like the jailer or like the doorman or whatever?
Yeah.
The comic character.
Yeah, that was interesting. It's always kind of interesting to see if they're going to keep that character or what they're going to do with that character, because Shakespeare gives him like a pretty lengthy monologue, you know, for some comedic relief after the king has been killed. In a lot of instances, that's just glossed over. You know, Orson Welles, I think maybe the porter keeps like 2 lines. Here, he's given a little bit more. You know, I don't know, man. You know, like I just like the by the end of the film, I just kind of felt like, yeah, I don't know, like.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's move on from the text and talk about the visuals.
Yeah. Well, we were getting there because we were talking about the A24 stuff.
Yeah, so A24 is this odd phenomenon because it's like a studio that has like a fan base, you know, which is kind of unusual as opposed to like a particular director.
Right. And granted, they've done a lot of cool stuff, and I loved The Witch.
Yeah. So, but anyway, they kind of, you know, good cinematography, good lighting, quirky images. And I know that people, you know, are on Twitter, our film Twitter, are sort of salivating over this screenshot of like the witch standing above the pool with the other 2 witches just as reflections.
Yeah, but it's dumb.
As though this is like a masterful,
I know,
like a masterpiece of cinematic imagery, but it's like it's cool, but it's just kind of like, oh, that's kind of cool.
And that's what's bothering me, is that it's beginning to feel almost like the art house equivalent of the Marvel universe. You know, something analogous seems to be happening here with A24, because they're taking these sort of like what would otherwise be the realm of like the art house or the indie, you know, and kind of streamlining it and making it like popcorn. This film has, you know, some like really striking images of like, I don't know, Lady Macbeth at like the edge of a cliff, you know, in profile. And it's like, okay, what? Like, because then we're just back to the movie. It's like there's like this sort of haphazardness to it.
At a certain point, you know, the rules of proportion are rules that one can apply to get a image that looks well proportioned, and clean, and well composed. But that doesn't really make it great cinematography.
It feels a little bit like a input-output
So this
formula.
is like very clean, expressionist, like ultra expressionistic kind of sets and, you know, clean lines and everything. And it's interesting because the Orson Welles thing also does this kind of expressionistic thing, but it's much less sort of crisp and like,
well, I mean,
it's much more atmospheric, actually.
Like the Orson Welles one, actually, it does something, right? It operates on you as a viewer. It's like claustrophobic and cavernous and subterranean. You know, it's like it's earthy and
Right.
primal and brutal, caveman like,
Yeah.
like there's all this stuff that it conjures up. Here, this did nothing for me. This was pretty. This was like elegant. But it also felt
Hmm.
kind of sterile, you know? And
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm all about minimalism, so this isn't like a knock on a minimal aesthetic, but like a minimal aesthetic to what end? Is it meant to like draw my attention to the performances? Well then, okay, but like we've already talked about the performances and they're not giving me a whole lot to latch onto. Is it
Right.
meant to like to fade away so that I can like attend more to the text? Okay, yeah, well, we've talked about the text and how the text
Hmm.
isn't really being, uh, uh, handled to its, fullest potential, or at least seemingly so. So,
Hmm.
like it just kind of ends up feeling kind of la- lacking. I got bored pretty quick, and
Hmm.
and sat through it basically,
Yeah.
and
I wouldn't say I got bored, but I wouldn't say that I was very moved by most of it either.
yeah, and I just feel like
Um,
that's a shame because
yeah.
we're not talking about just any old play here. We're talking about Macbeth, and um this just feels kind of it's an impoverished version of it seems to me,
Hmm.
on all these different levels. um I'm trying to think if like same with the costumes, like the costumes, I guess that it's like this gesture toward medieval Scotland, but
Hmm.
I think about the costumes in Orson Welles, like those are those are something, man. um
Yeah.
but
Macbeth's crown is pretty cool in the Orson Welles
yeah.
version.
Yeah, and you know I
Well, look at this too, man. Like, um, we were talking about like the passivity of um Denzel Washington's Macbeth, and he's like having visions and freaking out and stuff. But I really like the scene in before the feast when Macduff is leaving in the Orson Welles version, where Macbeth is sitting on the throne getting drunk,
yeah,
and that's a choice on Macbeth's
yeah,
part. He's getting drunk, and that is destabilizing his mental state further. And he's drunk when he has this vision of the ghostly figures of Macduff and Duncan. And so even that is more interesting in a way. It's interesting that we see this Macbeth slurring his words and telling
right,
the guys to go kill Macduff.
right, right. Yeah, totally, totally. And we see Lady Macbeth, responding to this,
Right.
with an admixture of concern, of frustration, of fear of what other people are going to think, maybe fear for
You know what? They
herself.
in the honestly in the Orson Welles, they play it like they're both just kind of depressed. They're just two old depressed people. Or sorry,
The
no, in
Cohen
the
one, yeah.
Cohen brother, the Cohen, not
Well,
Cohen
I thought
brothers,
about that.
one Cohen.
Yeah,
And they said that they were playing it as a postmenopausal Lady Macbeth, like they had never had children.
yeah.
I don't know how that works
Well,
with like the lines, but
well,
um,
I thought about that, and I thought, like how much of this of some of the way that I received this Macbeth and these performances, how much of that has to do with the fact that they're older? Like
mhm.
when you see a young man or a young woman, as they're often portrayed, you know, like not so young as to be a new kid on the block. Macbeth is a soldier, he's proven himself in battle, but he's ambitious. He's at the beginning of something. There's something really
Right.
sad to see someone who has all this promise, and because he can't wait for it or let it come to him of its own, and instead reaches out and takes it. I mean, again, it's Adam and Eve in the garden.
Right.
So there's something different when you're working with two older actors like this. And I could see there being like a whole angle to this of like, you have been a noble man your whole life. And now right at the end, you're going to just blow it all, and that's exciting to me, but that's not really what we see in this film,
Yeah. Macbeth is just kind of a sad sack.
Yeah. And Lady Macbeth is just kind of like an angry sack, like when he's having those visions, she just gets like mad at him. And then just kind of stays mad at him. So, it's like, I think that a lot of people are going to talk about this Macbeth and they're going to say, oh my gosh, it's inspired. It's a vision, and I think it's going to be because they're well, it's probably because of a lot of reasons, maybe people like genuinely like it. And in matters of taste, there could be no argument. So like, maybe I'll just say, this is my opinion, of course, you might think differently, but but I think that in some cases too, it's going to be because of an unawareness of what Shakespeare otherwise could be. Maybe this is the first time you've seen a Shakespeare adaptation on film. Maybe you don't have a lot of exposure to Shakespeare's works, and so you don't know what the potential is, or what the tradition of the performance of these characters is. But I think another thing is going to be like a certain starstruckness. I think people are going to look at this and go, "Oh, Joel Coen. Oh, Francis McDormand. Oh, Denzel Washington."
A24.
Yeah.
Visuals.
And like, this is great. And I'm just not buying it. I'm sorry. Denzel Washington is an amazing actor. Frances McDormand, an amazing actress. I was so excited for this. I watched several adaptations in preparation because I was just so excited to see the choices being made. It was like, I wanted to see what other people did with it so that I was even more aware of the choices that were being made here. And I think that that experiment was successful, that it did make me very aware of the choices that were being made. But again, I just didn't feel like there was much that was being delivered on by those choices, that at best they were kind of neat. At worst, they were reductive or undermining. Yeah.
All right.
I want to say one more thing.
Sure. I got to wrap up, but
yeah. Well, maybe I don't need to say it. I was just going to say that the action sequences bothered me, man.
Why?
Because it was like, they felt like very tonally dissonant with the rest of the play. It was like all of a sudden Denzel Washington would become like, it was like something out of a Bourne movie, and he's just like wrecking guys. And
where he stabbed the guy in the back.
Yeah, well, he's a great, action. He's like very capable of, on-screen violence. We know that from his previous movies. But here it just was like a little too sharp and polished and styled, and it just felt like it didn't belong in this world somehow. But maybe that's not worth mentioning.
All right. Well, that went longer than we expected, but thank you, James, for being my guest on today's interview. And
yeah,
I'm glad to have had you because you seem to know what you're talking about.
Well, I hope that, I hope I wasn't too hard on the thing, because like at the end of the day, it's not a bad movie. It's not that like anyone.
It's not really offensive.
Yeah, and it's not like things are poorly done. It's just that they're like kind of done to very small effect, and I get frustrated with that because I I'm a fanboy. I'm a fanboy. So maybe my expectations were too high. Maybe they were unable to be met. But then again, maybe not, and maybe this just wasn't that good.
Okay. All right, I got to run. But
Cool.
thanks again. Thanks everybody for listening. See you next time.